The ingeniousness of the ego to preserve itself is enormous, but it stems from the very power of the mind the ego denies. This means that the ego attacks what is preserving it, which must result in extreme anxiety. That is why the ego never recognizes what it is doing. It is perfectly logical, but clearly insane. The ego draws upon the one source that is totally inimical to its existence for its existence. Fearful of perceiving the power of this source, it is forced to depreciate it. The ego's existence is totally dependent on the mind's power to believe in it, and we have seen how the ego, in a seemingly paradoxical maneuver, negates that power, saying in effect, "What mind? You cannot see or dissect it in a laboratory. There is no mind, only a brain." Thus do the ego and its world depreciate their source. For example, almost all scientists allow into their study only what they can observe, manipulate, and control. But the mind transcends all such investigations, for the body was made not to know it. Bodily identification keeps the mind's existence forever inaccessible to recognition and understanding. This denial of its means of preservation cannot but engender instability and uncertainty in the ego, the part of us that cherishes being a special and unique individual. This threatens its own existence, a state which it finds intolerable. Remaining logical but still insane, the ego resolves this completely insane dilemma in a completely insane way. It does not perceive its existence as threatened by projecting the threat onto you and perceiving your being as non-existent. This ensures its continuance if you side with it, by guaranteeing that you will not know your own safety. A Course in Miracles speaks of the ego as if it were a person, a sentient self that in its anxiety plots, plans, and sets up defenses. In reality, however, the ego is simply a thought in the mind of God's separated Son. Jesus uses anthropomorphic symbols to describe what this mind does and feels, so he can help us look at its thought system of separation more objectively. He is really speaking of our confusion and anxiety, with which he cannot cope except by denying their source in the mind. The anxiety we all feel so deeply comes first from the terrifying belief that at any moment God will annihilate us, and second from the fear that if we return to the mind, we will annihilate ourselves by choosing against this terror-stricken self. Accordingly, we project our fear onto some external source where we can deal with it, thinking we have identified the problem. These projected specters are experienced as frightening, and following our insanely programmed brains, we delude ourselves into believing there is something we can do about them. Maladaptive forms of magic to solve the mind's non-existent problem of guilt and fear, perceived in the non-existent forms of the world. What can this be but pure madness? Nevertheless, these objects of fear are not the problem, which is only the seeming guilt that comes from our belief that there is a problem. The decision-making mind buries the conflict between the ego and Holy Spirit and sees it as external to us. We never realize that there is no conflict at all, inside or outside, only our mistaken identification with the ego. Having sought to preserve the existence of the separated self by seeing the imagined conflict as external to the mind, we shift the threat from the mind to the body we think of as our self. Ultimately, once again, the true problem is the false self's fear of its inevitable annihilation when we choose forgiveness over guilt, love instead of hate, oneness to take the place of separation.